the president, since becoming president and taking office, has slowly but steadily begun a maximum pressure campaign. As he called it the other day, a maximum economic pressure campaign. Oftentimes that entails economic sanctions. The first significant action was stripping the U.S. out of the Iran deal.
That was Garrett Marquis, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, speaking on one of the most important issues in today's news, which is North Korea and the policy of maximum pressure that is being applied by the Trump administration. And just yesterday, the White House announced that it would be sending 1,000 additional troops to Iran after the Iranian government said that they would be exceeding the limit set on uranium under the Iranian nuclear accords. In fact, Garrett was quoted just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal on the latest news involving Iran. He said, quote, "President Trump has made it clear that he will never allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. The regime's nuclear blackmail must be met with increased international pressure." And that's something we talk about on today's podcast. So if you want to know what's going on in Iran, what's going on in North Korea, and what the policy of maximum pressure actually means, then keep listening, because this podcast is for you. So remember, listen carefully, think critically, and conclude thoughtfully. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you are listening to Bills. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Bills with Luke Scorzel. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Garrett Marquis onto the show. Garrett is the spokesperson for the National Security Council and the special assistant to the president, and today he's a guest on Bills. So thank you so much, Garrett, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here, Luke.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the specifics of what's going on around the world in foreign policy, specifically in Iran and in North Korea. But first, I'd like to find out a little bit about your job and really help our audience understand what it is exactly that you do as the spokesperson for the National Security Council.
It's a great question. I sometimes ask myself that as it evolves often weekly. Broadly speaking, my job is to help communicate the president's national security policies to the public, often through press. A big portion of my job is providing direct support to Ambassador John Bolton, who's the national security advisor and one of the president's key communicators on all matters national security. And another key component is coordinating the various agencies that deal with national security matters, making sure that they are aligned with the president's policies, his positions, and the latest messaging. Often includes the State Department, Defense Department, the intelligence community, and various other agencies that weave in and out of national security matters.
And I'm sure that becomes oftentimes difficult when you have different perspectives within those very agencies and then the president itself. So how do you really manage when you have one policy coming out of one agency that might contradict or be different to a policy coming out of another agency?
Sure. So on national security matters, that's actually a primary function of the NSC, is to coordinate policy, understanding that different agencies have different equities, as we call it, different perspectives on various policies. What we try to do is take the guidance from the president and coordinate that with the agencies that are invested in each policy. And through a process that involves various interagency meetings, oftentimes over weeks and months, have pretty heavy and detailed conversations to ensure that the government is aligned. The various agencies are aligned on the policies and or the policy being discussed, and then therefore can communicate that effectively. And that's often where we come in is, okay, now that we understand the policy, that state has their position on this policy, which is aligned with Defense Department, which is aligned with, let's say, Department of Homeland Security. How do we best communicate that, both in terms of timing, also which platforms, and who might be the messengers? That's where the NSC Comm Shop, which is what I run, steps in and tries to do its best in coordinating the external effort.
And then what other positions did you hold before getting into that position, and what was kind of the trajectory to working for the National Security Council?
So my most immediate position actually is mostly is really the most relevant. That is, I was the founder and principal at a small public affairs firm here in Washington. One of our first clients was Ambassador John Bolton. So many years ago, when he was after the Bush administration, but certainly before the Trump administration, he provided advice, foreign policy and national security advice through a number of vehicles, including political action committees and also on Fox News and in his writings. And I worked closely with him on the communications front for a lot of his political work. That kind of provided me a vehicle to enter the NSC once the ambassador was named national security advisor. All that said, my background beyond that is more on the what I call the political side, with various campaign work. I worked in the Bush administration, also in the Senate, and then in California for the Reagan Foundation as well.
Yeah, so really all over in politics, and then focusing down. So have you always seen yourself getting into the communication side of the policy, or did you just kind of end up there?
So I noticed early on that I'm more of a communicator of policy as opposed to a developer of policy. So I prefer to be on the more of the external as opposed to the internal side of policy development, whether that was just by my personality or by the initial jobs I had out of college. I couldn't tell you. Nature versus nurture, I suppose. But over the years, it became clear that I really enjoyed thinking about how to effectively communicate various policy positions and messaging broadly, and working within, in this case, government, to try to be strategic so that we can be as effective as possible in terms of getting, again, focusing on the national security message to the various audiences, which changes, frankly. Sometimes it's purely an American audience. Oftentimes it's a foreign audience. Sometimes it's directed towards certain governments or countries. But we often think through, depending on the policy, who our audience is and what's the best way to reach them.
And that leads right into kind of the next section here is going into some of those actual foreign policy issues. So Iran has been one of the biggest foreign policy challenges, I think, for the Trump administration. Throughout the campaign, Trump was adamant about withdrawing from the Iran deal. And just a few weeks ago, the administration announced that it was going to be deploying an additional 1,500 troops to the country. But over this whole time period, the United States has been applying this policy called maximum pressure on Iran. Can you kind of explain and break down that policy for our listeners?
Yeah, so look, thanks for asking about Iran. It's an important issue. Listen, the president has been clear about Iran, as you mentioned, since his campaign. He thought the Iran deal was a terrible deal for America. It certainly was advantageous for the Iranians and very few others. The president, since becoming president and taking office, has slowly but steadily begun a maximum pressure campaign. As he called it the other day, a maximum economic pressure campaign. Oftentimes that entails economic sanctions. The first significant action was stripping the U.S. out of the Iran deal. And then following that was a number of actions against Iran's energy interest, often where it received most of its, or certainly a big portion of its revenue in order to fund a lot of its activities in the region. These activities, which are widely understood to be supporting terrorist activities, and also, frankly, activities that are just against American interest in the region. So we've steadily moved forward at the president's direction on this economic campaign. The Treasury Department and State Department have announced over the last 6 months a number of actions against Iran, including labeling or listing one of their military organizations as a terrorist organization, the Revolutionary Guard.
So just hopping in here for a tiny bit of context, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard is essentially a branch of Iran's armed forces and was founded after the Iranian Revolution. Back in 2010, there was a report from the U.S. Department of the Treasury announcing that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard actually funded multiple terrorist organizations, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and multiple others. This is a move that officially designates them as a terrorist group and has had a little bit of backlash from administration officials who say that this could incite retaliation against American troops and intelligence officers from Iran.
Guard. And that's not an insignificant action. It's actually very, very significant, and it continued to serve notice to Iran and others that the president is continuing his maximum pressure campaign, and will do everything possible to make sure that Iran changes. And the president has been clear. He is open to a conversation with the Iranian leadership, but he's also not going to stop.
Yeah, and how do these this most recent move of 1,500 troops going into Iran, how does that relate into the policy?
So this latest military action, which includes moving the carrier fleet into the region, is as much as anything a deterrence effort. The administration, with the president's direction, has been very clear. There was some intelligence that we understood, the administration understood, that threatened America interest and personnel in the region. And in order to deter any actions that the Iranians or their proxy groups might be considering against again, our interest, the president authorized the movement of the carrier group as well as the increase in troops into the region. It's important to really focus on the deterrence effort. This is not an effort in order to elevate our actions. It's simply done in order to deter Iran from taking any actions against America.
And ultimately, what is the administration's end goal for Iran? Is it to have a regime change? I don't think that's necessarily what Trump has voiced, but there have been reports that John Bolton has called for some very similar policies. So what is the ultimate goal, do you think, in Iran with this policy?
So first of all, it's clear the president has said he's not seeking military conflict with Iran, and he's also said over the last year that we would welcome, the U.S. would welcome Iran into the world order of normalized countries. Maybe a year or 12 months, 13 months ago, Secretary Pompeo laid out at the Heritage Foundation a list of 12 items where Iran, if they move towards these items, these actionable items where they become a developed and normalized country and they don't support terrorism, they open their economy, that they can then be welcomed into the world economic order. The U.S. policy is not, as the president says, regime change. It is trying to force the country through this maximum economic pressure campaign to evolve into a normalized country and to be a good neighbor in the region and also not a threat to Western allies and specifically America.
And in regards to Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, more recently he has actually said that he will meet with Iran without them meeting any of those conditions. How does that play into those 12 points that were laid out previous to that?
So the 12 points haven't changed. Secretary Pompeo is also very clear-eyed. Frankly, we've all taken the direction of the president, both Bolton, Secretary Pompeo, and Acting Secretary Shanahan from the Defense Department. This is all over the last month or so a deterrence effort. Because of whether it's moving personnel out of the Baghdad embassy or increasing our troop presence in the region. It is simply done in order to make sure that we are protected, one, and that our actions will hopefully deter Iran from taking any offensive actions against us or our interests. Secretary Pompeo is clear-eyed about that, and he's been an effective messenger for this president and the administration.
And one of the other key areas of foreign policy that I'd like to get into is in regards to North Korea, and there's been a similar policy of maximum pressure applied by the Trump administration to North Korea and dictator Kim Jong-un. So what is similar between Iran and North Korea that each needs to receive this policy of maximum pressure? And then is that pressure applied in the same way to both countries?
Yeah, so first I'd say that the president has been clear broadly with world leaders that he values a personal relationship, and he sees that as part of the broader strategy for geopolitics is making sure he has those good relationships with global leaders, whether they're allies or whether they're North Korea and Russia. In speaking about North Korea, multiple times the president has said, both to the press and also to Kim Jong-un, that he wants to open the door to economic prosperity for North Korea, that he believes that they can be a great economic nation and that there's a lot of potential if they simply completely denuclearize North Korea. He's been clear-eyed about that and has said that multiple times to his counterpart, the leader of North Korea, as well as to the press. Certainly, there might be parallels across the board with Iran and other countries, even Venezuela. But at the same time, the president and his advisors are no question clear-eyed about the difference between the countries, and that although certain strategies might work in the same countries, the reality is there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that is very different. And although the president is open to conversation, he believes not only in diplomacy but also in dialogue. He also understands that sometimes you need to back it up. And then in the case of Iran, that would be making sure that there is a deterrence effort. And Iran knows that we won't accept their offensive actions against our interests. So I want to be clear that although there is similar and parallel efforts that are taking place in a variety of countries, there is also a lot of differences, and it's based on regional interests as well as the president's personal relationships with the leaders. And in the case of North Korea, he has a personal relationship, and he values that strongly in the negotiations.
And in regards to North Korea, what do you think the consensus is in the administration as to whether the situation has been improving or not? Just last month, North Korea launched several short-range missiles, and there was a bit of disagreement between advisor John Bolton and Donald Trump on whether or not that actually violated some of the United Nations resolutions against missile testing from North Korea. So is there a developing consensus within the Trump administration in regards to the situation in North Korea?
So the president has been clear and consistent on his message with North Korea, both to the North Koreans as well as publicly, that one, he wants to protect American interest, and he said this as recently as a few weeks ago that the recent missiles that were fired didn't concern him. Most importantly, it didn't threaten American interest, and the president has been consistent about that point. And his priority is America and our concerns in the region. There's conversations that are taking place constantly on various activities that are happening both in Iran, Venezuela, and certainly North Korea and other countries. I certainly don't want to get ahead of the president, but he's constantly having detailed conversations with his advisors and the intelligence community on various activities that are taking place in hotspots across the world.
And ultimately, and this is kind of just a question that I have for you and how you view how an administration should work, or the ideas that are in the administration. Do you think that it's valuable to have a national security advisor and a president and maybe other cabinet positions that all have different views, or should they really align? There have been a lot of reports, I think, coming out fairly recently that Donald Trump and some of his advisors, especially John Bolton, aren't on agreement on a lot of things. So how do you kind of reconcile those different views within the administration?
Well, I'd first say just be careful what you read. There's a lot of quote reporting out there that is, as the president likes to say, called fake news. The president has said multiple times in regards to Ambassador Bolton, whether it's on Iran or otherwise, even recently, that the president is a decision maker, that the ambassador, be it a hawk or otherwise, is someone who advises him. He has other advisors who provide a different perspective, and he makes the final decision. That's not dissimilar to past presidents, frankly. If you name a president that has only like-minded views around him, or that's probably not a successful president. So, that the president gets different perspectives is probably a valuable thing. And the president, as John Bolton has said multiple times, is the decision maker. And whether it's Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Shanahan, or Ambassador Bolton providing counsel to him, the president is the one who makes the final decision, and everybody in his administration is well aware of that.
And then going back to North Korea, one of the interesting parts of the policy of maximum pressure is that there's economic sanctions, and they should be a pretty large burden on North Korea. But China is actually a fairly large factor in that situation. So how do you view and mitigate dealing with those sanctions? And then if the Chinese are providing kind of a backdoor of support to ease the burden of those, what is the policy looking like in that regard?
Yeah, so the policy towards North Korea and the maximum pressure campaign is unique in this administration in the sense that we've never seen such support out of the UN to put pressure on North Korea and hold sanctions, whether it's Russia, China, or other countries. It's actually unprecedented, the effort that this administration has done in order to put that pressure on North Korea. Whether we're talking about China or Russia, the president even recently has expressed to Russia that the President Putin, that is, that the maximum pressure campaign is only as effective as the neighbors of North Korea can enable it. And so he asked that Russia continue to enforce the sanctions and tighten the border. The president's clear about that. His advisors have expressed this sentiment also to their counterparts in various countries, and we can expect that to continue. That said, we can't ignore the reality that the campaign that the president has initiated against North Korea is incredibly effective. It is having an impact on the ground in North Korea, and that's not only due to the U.S. but also a number of our allies who have supported this effort through the UN.
Do you believe so? There have been two summits in North Korea thus far between Trump and Kim Jong-un. The last one was in Vietnam and ended abruptly and rather shortly. Do you believe that there will be a third summit? And then what will the president and the leader of North Korea be looking towards in resolution for that summit?
Yeah, I certainly don't want to get ahead of the president in any decisions that he or the State Department might be working on. I know that the president even recently has said he values his relationship with the North Korean leader, and he continues to see a future where North Korea has a bright economic and secure country. Whether there's a third summit this year, or a third summit next year, or sometime in the future, I think you can expect that the president will continue to prioritize his individual relationship, and the State Department will continue to work through its diplomatic means of ensuring that America and our interests are secure in the region.
And then lastly, kind of how does these diplomatic relations tie into the maximum pressure policies and the economic sanctions that are placed on these countries? Does that provides leverage for the United States? Can you kind of go into that?
Sure. So whether it's North Korea, Venezuela, or Iran, the three of the primary foreign policy and national security issues for this administration at this time, it's been clear that the president has wanted to use all means. He not only is pursuing diplomatic efforts, often at the head of state level, but also through the State Department, but also various pressure campaigns through Treasury with sanctions. In fact, this administration has really utilized sanctions in a way that's never been done before, trying to pressure through economic means both individuals, in the case of Venezuela, but also companies, both private companies as well as state-owned public companies, to move in a direction which the U.S. supports. It's been effective. It's been effective in Venezuela. We're continuing to see individuals who have flipped sides, and the Guaido government continue to find opportunities to generate support on the ground, but also in North Korea and in Iran, where the pressure campaigns, both diplomatic, where there's outreach and communication, but also sanctions, squeezing the economies of each country in order to move their leaders to conversations that we're looking to have, and also outcomes in which we see as in the best interest of the United States.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Garrett. It's been a pleasure. Where can our audience find out a little bit more about you?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Luke. The short story is you can find me through the NSC. How you'd get there is by calling the White House. My information is also generally online. Just do a quick Google search, and you can find about what issues I'm focusing on of late. And really what I'm focused on tends to be what the White House is looking at, the national security issues that are most relevant. I'm also on Twitter. There's an official handle for me on Marquis45, and that provides the latest information on social media for the National Security Council, at least, and the direction in which we're going every day or so.
Again, that was Garrett Marquis, the spokesperson for the National Security Council. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Hopefully you'll be able to use that knowledge to think about this issue and contribute to conversations on these types of issues around the world, because the maximum pressure policy is really the underlying tone for a lot of the foreign policy decisions for not only Iran, but also North Korea, obviously, and as he mentioned, Venezuela and several other countries. So it's something that's key to understanding multiple issues going on in the world today, which is what I'm bringing you here on Bills. So be sure to go over to theedgeofideas.com/subscribe and put in your email address for weekly emails only when an episode is published. And if you'd like to go over to iTunes or Spotify and subscribe there, I would greatly appreciate it. And remember to join the conversation on Twitter. My handle is Luke Scorzel, and you can tweet me anytime with suggestions for the show, questions that you'd like guests to answer, or even potential guests that you'd like to have on the show. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you next time. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you are listening to Bills.